All right, we are here with Isaac Morehouse, and we're going to be talking about all things crypto, adoption, marketing, and just business development that are going on. So, Isaac, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me here. This is like a super fun experience because I am not a professional crypto person. I'm not a technical person. I've been really passionate about it and following it, and have owned Bitcoin since 2012, I think. And so it's kind of like a hobby of mine. So this is sort of fun to be able to, pop in and talk about something that I'm interested in, but as a lay person.
For sure, for sure. And it's great to have the multiple perspectives that come into the arena to sort of debate these issues. And I saw you were throwing some commentary out there on Twitter, and just thought it'd be great to flesh these ideas out further. So for anyone that doesn't know you, can you give a little background on yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I am the CEO of a company called Crash, which is a pretty new startup, which is a career launch platform to help people sort of find and win their first professional job. And prior to that, I founded a company called Praxis, which is a startup apprenticeship program. I founded that in 2013 and have grown it, and hundreds of people have gone through the program. And it's a college alternative, and then come out the end, getting their career started without any debt, most of them without any degrees, working in startups. And, all of that, starting Praxis and then eventually Crash, that all came out of a very philosophical journey. Sort of my intellectual and career journeys have followed this trajectory, which the passion that I've always had is freedom. I want to live free, and I want to help other people live free. And so it kind of began with like, oh, well, how do you do that? Maybe you go and help people directly. And I did like humanitarian mission type stuff when I was a teenager, and pretty quickly I realized, okay, that's not where it comes from. It's the political institutions people live under. So I then got involved in politics, and I realized pretty quickly that politics is a lagging indicator of broader social changes, and politicians are followers, not leaders. So then I got involved in some think tanks with sort of policy advocacy and education. And I finally kind of realized that while I believe that beliefs are the ultimate binding constraint on the kind of world we live in, like how free we are, what kind of experience we have, it's ultimately people's beliefs, right? If people believe that it is necessary for governments to ban certain things, then they will allow governments to get away with it. And ultimately, if they don't believe that, then they can't get away with it, right? If you tried to ban alcohol today, you wouldn't get away with it because people don't believe that. They won't allow governments to do that. So it is belief, but I was focusing entirely on the part of belief that is formed by direct argument and ideas, and thinking like it's ideas. You just got to convince people about free markets and freedom and all this stuff. And while I think that's valuable, and some percentage of people form their beliefs based on sort of explicit argument ideas, I came to the realization that experience is the greater portion of what forms people's beliefs. And rather than, for example, something I'm particularly passionate about, trying to argue people into agreeing with me that higher education and education in general is a mess and government shouldn't be subsidizing it and you should just forget the whole system and go do something different, trying to win that argument intellectually is not only an uphill battle, but it makes you really unhappy. And instead saying, okay, look, if I'm right, then this is a market opportunity. Let me build an alternative. Let me actually create the kind of world I want to live in and say, here, I don't need to convince you of anything intellectually. Here's a way that you can get your career started better without debt. And if it works, then people will come around. And obviously this is the story of, Uber. You don't need to convince people that taxi cartels are a bad idea. You just give them an alternative. And this is the story of Bitcoin, right? We can argue about the Federal Reserve all day and try to audit it and all this stuff, or we can create an alternative. And that's kind of what led me on this journey to entrepreneurship, from kind of being an ideas person and kind of focusing on purely the intellectual side. Now I sort of see my entrepreneurial efforts as this is me putting my ideas in practice. And it's a field experiment rather than a thought experiment.
Well, that's awesome. You're certainly on point when it comes to thinking about a lot of the political ideas that people come to this world of cryptocurrency and other subcultures like it, with these ideals of we have to strive for freedom, we have to open up new spaces. But yeah, the vehicles and the vectors that are towards that seem a little bit stagnant. But then when you start to see some of the achievements sort of in the tech and startup sector, you say, hey, like that's where the energy is, that's where we can make a difference. And then Bitcoin rolls along. And it's almost like this is the ultimate expression of that mentality of what more exclusive item, to the state is money, if not that. So when Bitcoin comes along, we find this vector to really have real change that not only combines our ideals of freedom and sort of libertarianism and et cetera, but also the mindset of being an entrepreneur and being a market agent and letting the market decide if our ideas are actually valid. So with that being said, what was it about Bitcoin that just clicked in your head?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was sort of it was a bit of a process. So it was about 2012. I was at a seminar. It was like some sort of libertarian seminar. And it was like a lunchtime discussion, and people were talking about monetary policy, as pretty much only libertarians do in casual conversation. And one of the students there was like, people were debating the gold standard versus competing currencies and all this different stuff. And one of the students said, well, I like this like purely 100% digital money, and it's not backed by gold or anything. And somebody's like, well, how is that even possible? And they're like, no, Bitcoin, like, haven't you heard of this? And I think I had like heard it floating around somewhere. And so the discussion got going, and I was pretty interested in it. And then I kind of followed up. I don't remember where I came across a few articles in a few places. And I think I eventually read the white paper, or at least the parts of it that I could understand. And then I got on like whatever, I don't even remember the exchanges that were around back then, but I acquired some because I found it years later when I had forgotten about it. And I think Jeffrey Tucker at another seminar, I'll never forget, he was like, oh, let me send you a Bitcoin. Let me send you like just 4 or 5 Bitcoin or something. And I'm like, I don't have a wallet set up on my, I don't know. I'll figure it out later. No, just let me send you a handful of Bitcoin or whatever. And I never took the time to like send it. Anyway, they were worth whatever, a couple bucks. And then as soon as Coinbase launched, I don't remember when Coinbase launched, but I was like one of the very first people, because it was like just the easiest on-ramp between a normal bank account for a normie like me who didn't have to do all sorts of weird stuff. And I just put on like basically an automatic weekly buy at a pretty low amount, and just sort of been, kind of the more that you like get into it and own it. And I would send it to people all the time and try to like use it whenever possible at these little marketplaces, because it was like fun. It was cool. The more that you do that, the more intellectually interested you are. And so I kind of found pretty quickly the radical implications, because I already was really familiar with the Austrian School of Economics and monetary policy and all these things. So like, I got the implications of a purely free market money right away. It took me a while to understand how this could possibly work, and to sort of get to understand like, oh, okay, it like solves the Byzantine generals problem. And this is how you have something that is, able to do this without trusted third parties, et cetera. So like theoretically, I wanted it to work from the minute I heard about it as a market-based money that's global, that's not tied to anything else. It has a cap on inflation, so the price can be the supply is totally transparent. But it took me a while to like really start to, the more I learned, the more I was like, oh my gosh, this is a bigger deal than I thought at first. This is like truly solving a very big technical problem that has kept this from existing to date. And so it's kind of been deeper down the rabbit hole ever since.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And you talk about how like you found it personally, and you were trying to evangelize to people here and there, or sending it around. Did you find any utilization of it within sort of any project that you're working on in more of a large scale business sense?
Yeah. So, I remember I felt like early on, and I'm really bad at remembering specific dates and times, but somehow in that first sort of era that I was involved, just paying attention to Bitcoin and things, it seemed like every day or every couple of weeks when I would pop into a Reddit or wherever, there's like a new merchant is accepting it, or some new online vendor. And I would go and like try to, play around with whoever was doing it. And I'm trying to think, there was, even with Praxis, when we first started 2013, probably in 2014 or maybe 2015, I connected with BitPay and figured out how to accept Bitcoin. And we had, I think, 1 or 2 participants actually paid us in Bitcoin. And like, I was eager, like, let's just do this whenever possible. I think I put things on my website. Hey, if you want to do Bitcoin, occasionally I would get someone, giving me some Bitcoin. So like, it wasn't it was never a big part of like everyday life, but I went out of my way trying to find ways to use it. And it felt like there was this momentum just all the way up until the blocks got full and the whole, ridiculous, the whole project got set back, God knows how many years with the fork and everything. But, so I kind of just saw it as like, yeah, it's moving towards mainstream adoption, all this stuff. Never foresaw the craziness of, let's restrict the block size and all this stuff, which just like seemed absurd. So
that brings us into, sort of the conversation where we're at today, where there was all this energy and it was nascent, it was early stage back then. And as we hit the scaling debate in around 2014, 2015, there seemed to be this like just sapping of the enthusiasm. And then we wind up in 2017 and it's just this speculative boom. And it's like everyone, everybody remember Bitcoin and every other cryptocurrency is out there. But the funny thing was that it was all about just piling into Bitcoin to make like a quick buck. It wasn't like, hey, let's use a new form of currency to subvert, monetary policy. So this is the really weird thing is like now we're here in the future and it's almost never been more popular. But like you said, it's also never been more sort of handicapped.
Yeah. And there's I'm kind of two minds about that, right? There's the part of me, the libertarian part of me that's like, it's about freedom and all this stuff and just all this crazy speculation mainstream. But on the other hand, like if Bitcoin is to matter at all, it's the vast majority of people have to not care at all about the ideology, right? Like the people that use Uber don't care about the morality of taxi cartels. They care that Uber is useful to them. So like, I get that and I'm all about that. Unfortunately, I think because of the blocks being restricted and all this stuff and a lot of shenanigans going on, frankly, in the space that seems fairly unlikely to be organic. It's sort of just like a wild speculative vehicle. That's the main way that the rest of the world knows about it, not really as a useful thing. Now, I'm sure there are some places that are, people in places that are using it fairly regularly, but that's kind of sad. But here's where I think the book that you and I talked about that I had tweeted about and you said you picked up, Alchemy by Rory Sutherland, who's a marketing guy. Here's where maybe we bring that into the discussion because I was thinking about it before we got on here. And there's a lot of ways in which that book has a lot to say about crypto and kind of the current state of things. Do you want me to just give like a synopsis of the main thesis of the book?
Jump into it.
All right. Because this will help I think some of my thoughts on crypto, where we are. So the basic idea, and Rory Sutherland, if you look him up, he has a couple great TED Talks. He's like an advertising man, but he's like well steeped in Austrian economics. And he's a really interesting guy and a great thinker, very clever. And so the book is essentially about costly signaling and about things that appear to a sort of rationalist, reductionist, planner type mind to be wasteful and inefficient, and how those things actually serve a function and breaking down what that function is. So everything from advertising and Super Bowl ads that seem like a giant waste of money because they don't make the product any materially better, to the placebo effect, branding a drug. Why would you do that? It costs all this money, but it actually like makes people get better results because they believe that they will. And sort of walking through the value of things that appear irrational, especially to a certain personality type. Now, he rips on economists in particular, and he's sort of saying that this is the anti-economic mindset. I might squabble with his definition because economics, as I see it, and as kind of the Austrian school defines it, I think is very consistent with his approach. But it's really just sort of about the subjective nature of value and how a lot of things that appear to be wasteful turn out to be really, really important and necessary. And I guess a great sort of final example in a relatively modern times, I think it was in maybe 2016, one of these presidential elections, one of the candidates, Bernie Sanders or something, was like, there are 18 kinds of deodorant on the shelf. That's utterly ridiculous. That's a waste. Capitalism is wasteful. We shouldn't have 18 varieties of deodorant, right? And it's like, that's what the rationalist planner thinks. That's what Soviet economy thought, that you don't need this is waste. And Sutherland is just pointing out that this is not wasteful. There's a rational reason that all these things occur, branding and signals and the information economy. And you need this. You need this competition. You need these sort of apparently wasteful expenditures, right? It's why banks have marble floors put in, because they need to signal to you that they're not a wildcat bank that's going to take your money and run. They've put a ton of money into this facility and they wouldn't abandon it. That's a costly signal. Your brain subconsciously interprets it and says, this bank is legit. I can trust them with my money. It serves an informational purpose. So that's the thesis of the book. Now, there's kind of like 3 levels of analysis related to crypto that I kind of think of. The first and the most simple one is like, Bitcoin itself is a form of costly signaling. That's what makes the whole system work. The proof of work system is like, hey, I spent a ton of resources in order to do this. You know, like there's an inefficiency to it that like a pure computer nerd will look at and be like, that's so stupid. What an inefficient database system. It burns up so many resources. That's the reason why it's secure and why it's valuable and why it's hard to break. That the incentive structure, the costly signaling is kind of what makes it work. And so there's that level of analysis. But I think there's something else that I started to think a lot about as I was reading the book in regards to the scaling debate and the eventual split of Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. And that is kind of the rationalist, the expert mindset that's like, Bitcoin is this pure technological thing, and we need to pick the optimal way to have the optimal level of decentralization or the optimal level of security. And that's the same thing that Rory Sutherland criticizes with people who say, oh, well, the train in London, we need to engineer it perfectly to run a little bit faster. And he's like, the additional value of having it run a little bit faster to the train riders is tiny compared to the value you could get for way less money than this multi-billion-dollar thing to make it go faster, of like putting in nicer chairs and giving everybody free champagne. They'd be begging for the train to be slower, right? Because value is subjective, and there's a level of security that's not worth it, right? Like the additional 2% of security or decentralization or whatever. And so that idea of like the planner trying to perfectly optimize this system like it's some non-human robotic thing, whereas no, it's an economic system. And it's about the incentives and the institutions and things that you think are inefficient, transactions that you call spam and say are wasteful and bad for the network. That's the kind of stuff that's actually needed. We need that feedback. We need the market to let us know, because we don't know what's inefficient and what's not. Is it a waste for a company to buy Super Bowl ads? I don't know. You don't know. There's a reason they're doing it, and we better let the market process figure out what is and isn't inefficient. So that's kind of the second level of analysis. Before I have a third level that's maybe a lot more controversial about trustlessness, but I want to get your thoughts. When you read the book, what made you think that this relates to crypto? What could, sort of have made that connection for you?
Sure. Well, I definitely want to hear that controversial point because, this is CoinSpice and we're spicy here. We'll
get real spicy, baby. I got a spicy wall color behind me. It's perfect.
There we go. Yes, we like to be spicy. But yeah, when I started to dive into the book, I really was impressed with a lot of the points that you brought up, where he's bringing forth this conflict between the planner and perhaps what you would call the feeler, and to make it even more simpler. Where you have someone that sort of builds a model and they have to be very quantitative, and anything that does not fit within that model is ergo wrong. However, the feeler, kind of senses, well, what's actually, going on, what's happening outside the model, and, what is actually getting us to what we want to feel, not just like what the plan says, because all we care about at the end of the day is how we feel. And so he goes deeper and deeper into this. And I think you talked about costly signal as your first point of, what makes Bitcoin really cool. And there's another example that he brings up in the book where he talks about the London cabbie system. And for those people that don't know, what happens in London, there's a very regulated system of how they have black cabs. And basically, to become a cab driver in London, you have to pass a whole series of exams and prove that you know every single route, every alleyway, every shortcut within the entire city, just memorize in your brain. And they've actually done studies on these drivers over the years that shows they have like a larger part of their brain matter where sort of their memories go. So like this is a hugely difficult task that takes years to master, where you would say, why does a cab driver need to go through all that anguish and studying to become a driver when like now we have Uber and like you have a GPS that can just tell you where to go. And I think this is where Sutherland really gets to the heart of the issue where, well, what if I'm, arranging a trip for my daughter and, I can choose a black cabbie or I can choose, a random, app driver. And, there might be pretty, substitutable things going on there. But what he's saying is, well, I really care about the safety of my daughter. And maybe sort of someone that's more casual, more fly by night that is servicing an app, I can't trust them. Whereas somebody that put 5 years into becoming a cabbie isn't going to like do something drastically that's going to evaporate all that costly signaling that they did. And so actually, I'm not just getting a driver when I choose the cabbie over the Uber driver. I'm getting somebody I trust to escort my daughter to, the airport. And so I think that's the awesome thing he brings out in a bunch of examples. And then he articulates in sort of the abstract realm where he talks about how, no, you're not actually just getting, maybe the obvious thing that's on the surface where it's the cabbie knows the best shortcuts. No, but you're getting the trust of the cabbie to know that he's not going to screw you over and that the costly signaling is the vital part of that.
Yeah, it reminded me of something. I've heard this, and I don't know if this is true. I've never actually looked it up, but let's just pretend it is for the sake of this argument. I've heard that airplane wings are much thicker or more rigid, I guess, than they need to be technically for the plane to fly safely on commercial airlines. And the reason is if you pay $400 for a ticket, you're sitting there for 4 hours, and you look out and you see the wing doing this, it's going to freak you out and you feel unsafe. And so it's like, that it's an inefficient thing, but because the point of the airplane isn't just to be optimally technically efficient, it's to make money from passengers, and passengers want certain things. It signals certain things to them. They feel more comfortable. Their subjective experience matters. That's another example of, something inefficient. And that one made me think of, the block size in the following way, that, you see a lot of sort of criticism or mocking from people who are like small blocks. Why would we need the blocks to be bigger than the demand? Well, when you're thinking from a business standpoint, or even just like a branding standpoint, as somebody who's trying to assess the seriousness of Bitcoin as a legitimate potential global currency, if it's like, well, the blocks are big enough to handle the tiny amount of transactions that are going on today. And you're like, yeah, but could it actually handle real stuff? Well, it'll get there when it gets there. It's inefficient to optimize for that now. Well, it doesn't matter if it's inefficient. It signals something. If you're like, hey, look, a 32 meg block just went through, and some technical guy is going to be like, well, that's dumb. It was just a test with a bunch of spam transactions. It's like, it doesn't matter that it's dumb. It's signaling to other people that this thing actually can do a lot, that this thing actually is ready for prime time, and that it can handle a giant spike. Like if I'm a business and I'm thinking about adopting it, I'm thinking, I want this thing to become big. And if it becomes big, I don't want it to crash. And if it's never done more than 2 megabyte blocks at a time, how do I know what happens when it scales up? And if you're like, yeah, usually the blocks are a couple megabytes, but sometimes they've been as big as 32 or more, that's a good sign to me. And I don't care if it's considered wasteful or whatever else from a software standpoint. So anyway, I was just thinking about that, like, because it signals to people so much more. They want to know what happens under the worst conditions, what happens in an extreme condition, how much have you put into this? Like, I don't want to just trust that it's going to grow in a way that I've never seen. I want to have some proof of that, right? Proof of work. So this is interesting. And I was thinking about this a lot too. So you mentioned with the black cabs, the reason that this costly thing of learning all this, whatever, is because it gives you a higher ability to trust them. And the idea of an expensive signal or an inefficiency as a way of producing trust, you might think, well, that seems sort of counter. The whole point of Bitcoin is a trustless system, right? And here's my controversial point where I think that we can glean a few things from the Alchemy book that may come off as heretical to crypto people, but I don't think it is. I think we've sort of been loose and fast and misunderstood the concept of trustlessness in the Bitcoin system, and saying it's trustless, you don't have to trust anybody, is not quite right. Because I think you are always trusting something, someone or something. And it's where the trust is placed, right? So the whole point of Bitcoin, it's like capitalism. It's so that you don't have to trust the goodness or good intentions of a specific individual or company, but it doesn't mean you have no trust. In fact, there's a ton of trust involved. You're trusting the system itself. You're trusting the incentive structure. And so a concrete example, if you're in a well-functioning, roughly capitalist society, and you go to the store and you go buy some fish to bring home for dinner for your family, you don't need to have any trust in the individuals working at that grocery store to know that they're not going to poison that fish. And you don't even really have to trust the particular company or store as a whole, because you have trust in the system itself, the incentive structure. You know, you have enough faith in the system that this company would not be poisoning fish because they wouldn't survive in this whole system. I don't think that my fish isn't poisoned because I believe that Sam Walton or whoever owns the company is a good person, or the employee who put it on the shelf is a good person. I don't need to trust them, but I have trust in the system itself as this accountability mechanism. And that's a lot of trust versus if you go to an economy that's very corrupt. You notice people do things like when they get money, they hold it up to the light to make sure it's not counterfeit. If you buy something from shady back alley guy in some dark, corrupt economy, you have to know that you can trust him personally, or you have to verify that he's not poisoning you, because you can't trust the system. When you can't trust the incentive structure and the broader system, that's when you have to start trusting individual people or companies. And that's where it's really dangerous. And so I think the point of Bitcoin, it's not that it's trustless, it's that your trust doesn't need to reside in a specific individual or company because it resides in the incentive structure. And so the final thought on this is that part of that structure in both capitalism, and I think we need more of this in Bitcoin, is brands. And the concept of brands, Sutherland talks about a lot in his book, that things being branded and having a brand on them is a very important mechanism for telling our brain that this entity is part of the system of accountability and trust. So he used an example of these hoverboards that were coming out and no one was really buying them. It was like this new toy because they were all made by these anonymous companies and there was no one brand that was like the hoverboard brand. And what that means when you go to the store and you see it's a new product, you're unfamiliar with it, and there's a million undifferentiated brands, your brain is telling you if there's no one brand, who's going to be accountable? They're all undifferentiated, so nobody has an incentive to make sure the quality is high because no one company is really going to suffer reputationally if it's not. And so brands are a really important part of a system in which you trust sort of the broader incentive structure rather than having to trust the goodwill of individual companies. And so where we are currently with Bitcoin, I see a lot of discussion about how can an open source, and this is what happened. This is what, I remember when Mike Hearn left the project, like this open source model of the software development. It's not so much about the miners, their incentives are good. The software development itself as open source, there's some unfigured out yet issues about how this is going to work. And, we've got some sort of debates now as well. How should the governance of the sort of protocol go? My thought is take advantage of brands. And if you have a bunch of branded versions of different implementations, then that can be run and that there's accountability. If it's just like this open source product that a bunch of people are contributing to and you have to kind of like trust the good intentions of individual people, or like it's this sort of unbranded blob of a protocol development process or one implementation, I think that's riskier than sort of branded competing implementations that they suffer if they have an upgrade that the miners or the network, doesn't like. So I kind of think that's an interesting, maybe it's a bit of a stretch and I'm not going to pretend to get into all the technical stuff, but I think the idea of trustlessness is a little bit overly broadly applied. It's more about having a system where you can trust the incentives and not have to trust individuals' good intentions. But it's a system that has a lot of trust. That's why it works. You trust the black cabbie because of his incentives, not because you interviewed him. You trust when you buy food from the store, you're not going to be poisoned, not because you interviewed the people who made it, but because you understand capitalism will punish them if they don't. And I think there's that one component of crypto that hasn't quite been figured out yet, which is the protocol development component. How do you get that to where you don't have to rely on goodwill and good intentions?
Yeah, so I think you're very on the money there, pun intended. When you talk about it, I could be also of the controversial camp, but there is something to the degree of there is not zero trust, and maybe a better term is trust minimized to get to the point where we are with cryptocurrency. And when we think about, well, how do we create trust in the areas that need to be there? Because there's always going to be trust if, let's say, everyone isn't a developer or everyone isn't fully educated on the aspects of Bitcoin in a surface level sense. You know, the person that uses the Coinbase app has to trust the Coinbase app that everything functions in the inside that is going to, you know, suit whatever service they want there. So there's always trust, but it's the system that's perhaps creating the minimized trust where we get to a point that's optimal. But when we get to the brands, then we start running into problems, because you mentioned the open source software ethos here. And, you know, that is definitely a benefit that has produced so much surplus value. And perhaps a lot of the private companies that exist today would not exist without this sort of sharing dynamic between open source developers. But with that being said, there's almost this weird outgrowth of that, which happened really in the BTC group, where you had sort of the throwing away of brands, saying like there was the thing of like, we have no leaders in Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't owned by anybody, or you know, a company over here, you know, obviously a Blockstream, or this company, that company, this person, this bigwig. They don't actually have a say or a big sway when it comes to the direction of where Bitcoin will go. But anybody looking at it with a, you know, with some sense, they're saying like, of course, there's like a hierarchy, and people are mover and shakers, and obviously there's brands associated with stuff.
Yeah,
So,
that whole like we are all the users, we are all one, we are one community, we are one cult. Like, to me, that's kind of a scary place to be, right? That's like the sort of, and there are leaders and things, but it's like, oh, but we're all one, we're all working, we all have to just be unified all the time. That's like the idea that the well-meaning, you know, Soviet people have. Oh, all this competition is inefficient. Let's all be of one mind and one voice. And like, to me, it's like, no, how about you just explicitly say, hey, we're Blockstream, we're a brand, and we're going to run one implementation, and we're another brand. Like, and this is why I think the more consumer layer is a little better, right? Like, Coinbase is a brand, and they're going to suffer if they do things wrong. And so like, that's why I feel like there's a higher level of sort of customer support and accountability there. And I would like to see more sort of explicit competing brands, rather than, hey, let's all be nice and be a community at maybe at the software development level, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You say how it's like a Soviet society. It's like the dictatorship of the proletariat that comes out, but in reality, it's, you know, a few people that are in the walls of the government that are deciding everything.
And I gotta say, I have never been so suspicious of social media as when I started to really sense the big split with the scaling debate with BTC and BCH. Crypto Twitter, there's just has to be so many fake accounts. It's so weird to me. And I did not expect that. Like, I'm not like getting all conspiratorial, but like, you go and you see these threads and you just have all these comments, and I started to click on them, and the number of accounts that were created in like the last 3 months or whatever, and all they are is just, and you just start to think, how many people are actually in sort of the crypto community, and how much of this is manufactured? It's really pretty wild to see. And it's almost scary how easy it is to create or alter a narrative. Like, it doesn't take a lot. And I've told young people, hey, if you want to like go build a career, just go get reasonably knowledgeable about crypto, become reasonably good at communicating, and like create a show or a podcast for 6 months straight, and you'll be like invited to conferences. The space is so hungry for competence and communicators that like, it's amazing how much influence someone can have, which has good things, but it also is a little bit, a little bit scary.
Yeah, it's definitely the barrier is low. And while that's great for some individuals to get a jump start, it allows others that are maybe not the best suited to also get in there. And there's certainly those influencers out there that,
I mean, I can't complain because I'm on a crypto podcast, which I have no business, being on. So that it's to my benefit, I guess.
Yeah, well, don't give away my secret. But yeah, there's some other aspects of the book that he goes into that I think is pretty cool. And I think this is a good meme to think about the 4 S's that he brings up. And you've already mentioned one of them, signaling. But he also goes on to talk about subconscious hacking, satisfying, and psychophysics. And of course, the last one only sounds like an S. It actually has a P in front of it. But that goes with the entire flow of the book because it doesn't have to logically make sense. In fact, one of the other quotes that I love from the book is, he says here too, like, my problem with Marxism is that it makes too much sense. And so I think that goes to the larger point of, there's sort of what he also describes as the logic and the psychologic. And so that's a thing that's not like exactly 2 + 2, but equals 4, but it's like 2 + 2 = 5, but it still works. So with those 4 S's being said, we talked about the purpose of signaling, but what are your thoughts on the relation of crypto and those 3 others: subconscious hacking, satisfying,
yeah.
Yes, and psychophysics.
I don't know if I'll have a point for each of them, but I think
Sure.
on the so subconscious hacking is sort of the process of recognizing that we are not like robots as humans, and that things like the placebo effect actually work. And once you know that you can activate your brain to do certain things by almost tricking it, right? By making it think that something is really high quality, for example, and that will make it taste better to you or whatever. Once you sort of realize this, you can almost use it to enhance your quality of life by kind of hacking and tricking yourself. The only analogy that I really have for crypto there is like, I get so much value and utility out of crypto purely as a form of like entertainment and quality of life enhancement.
Yeah.
So I've often said, like, I don't own crypto primarily because it's the speculative asset I think I'm going to get rich on. I own it because being a part of it, having a little skin in the game, it's so like intellectually satisfying. It makes my brain think that what's happening in crypto Twitter or whatever is way more important because I own some. And that makes my life more fun. It gives me this fun escape, this hobby, this thing that I enjoy. And obviously I care about the freedom implications and everything, but like, it's almost like recognizing if you can sort of treat it as a game and like, look, whatever happens, I don't need a particular outcome to happen for out of crypto, but I can make my life more enjoyable by almost playing the game and raising the stakes for myself by becoming a part of it. Satisficing is kind of that idea of, you don't need something to be perfect. You just need it to be good enough. And I think that really comes to a lot of the things we're talking about, that whole idea of the problem with Marxism that makes too much sense. It's kind of speaking to the really smart, technical minded person is like, okay, if everyone would behave the way that I imagine they ought to behave, this world would be so much better. Unfortunately, people don't, right? And that's where I think you have this really interesting thing in crypto where you have a tension between highly technical people and highly ideological people who are like the Redditors of the world and who are either very much on the libertarian freedom philosophical side and or the technical computer nerd sort of side. And I'm not denigrating either of those. I think they're both amazing, and I'm definitely a libertarian type. But there's a tendency to think in terms of, this project needs to be maintained in philosophical or technical purity, and not recognizing that like the world doesn't give a shit. Like if you don't have a 10x better user experience than the status quo, then the friction of adoption is just too high to make it worthwhile. And like, that's what really breaks my heart about this stuff. Once upon a time, Bitcoin was about the only way I could instantly send money from my phone to your phone. And that wasn't that many years ago. And because of all the scaling debate and all this stuff and all this focus on the optimal level of decentralization and miners, are they good or are they bad? All this ideological and technical fighting. Meanwhile, the user experience, what happened was PayPal and Venmo and all these, other things caught up. And now the use case is much weaker because there's not a lot of stuff that Bitcoin can do to the average person, because they're not thinking about censorship resistance. They're thinking about sending you $5 that shows up on your phone instantly for very little fees. You can do that with PayPal and Venmo and whatever. And so that's sad to me. It's like the satisficing idea of good enough to accomplish the job versus perfect in some theoretical, hermetically sealed environment. That's a really persistent tension in something like this, where you do have community and open source so much a part of what's happening. Meanwhile, like practical minded business types and consumers are the ones that need to adopt it if it's to ever become big. And there's definitely a tension in those two things. So I think that's a valuable lesson.
Yeah. And you hit on an interesting point there where, we have to think about this in business terms. It can't just be purely ideological, even though that there is a sort of a foundation there. But with that being said, moving into more of that startup mindset, and this is where I like to come to the table a lot, and thinking about like lean startup methodology and how you should tackle adoption. What I always find frustrating is efforts to gain adoption seems to be, we have to boil the oceans. Like everyone is our customer. And I'm sure the next part of the sentence is that no one is your customer.
Yeah.
So with that being said, like as we think about the psychology of how we get people to adopt crypto while wrapping that up in good UX and good performance, is there an actual issue when it comes to people saying, why aren't people adopting this, when we really should be thinking, well, who is crypto best for? And are we actually marketing to that demographic and receiving the highest ROI? Are we going into like the mom and pop coffee shop every time and we're like, of course, like, they're going to use it once when we go in there and then they're not going to use it at all. Whereas somebody that has maybe a more acute experience with censorship resistance, which is really sort of maybe the main value play now that Venmo and PayPal, like you've said, are taken off, are they perhaps the people we need to seek out more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's sort of two philosophies even within startups on this, and both have worked for different types of companies. So there is the very tight, kind of like Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 talks about, like you pick the tightest niche you possibly can as your initial market and you totally dominate it. And then you expand from there. And so you'll see companies like Superhuman, the email client, is like, they literally don't even let you use their product unless you get on some wait list, and it's only for Apple users and whatever. And they're like making it perfectly fit the needs of one tight market, and then they expand. Facebook started with only Harvard, then only Ivy League, then only colleges, and then expanded. But there are other types of markets and types of startups where that may not work, where like take banking, for example, or a credit card. If you were to come and say, we are a new bank, and there's a lot of these coming up for startups. We're a bank for startups. If you have a credit card or a payment system and there's just hardly anyone that uses it, no, you can't even pick a small market, because banking has to be such a liquid thing with such wide acceptance. It has so much network effect that you basically have to, and those are very capital intensive businesses. You have to raise a ton of capital, get through all the regulatory hurdles, become accepted everywhere before you can even go out to the initial market, because otherwise your value proposition is dead. The first time I go to use it at a gas station and it's not accepted, I'm like, well, screw this card. I'm going back to American Express or whatever. And so there are different approaches for different types of businesses. It's a really good question with crypto. I do think that there, like one business that has skin in the game and that has built a actual company that's thriving and making revenue is BitPay, and they have found their primary business, from my understanding, is international B2B transfers of money using crypto. And that is a use case where crypto still has, Bitcoin, or I think they also allow Bitcoin Cash and some others. It has a decided advantage over a lot of the other options when you're moving large amounts of money from one business to another internationally. It's a lot faster. It's a lot cheaper. Even with high fees, it's a lot cheaper. So that's one use case that is actually in use right now, and there's a real market for that. That's nowhere near as amazingly exciting as the global currency that's going to take over the world, but it's possible that you start with one niche and dominate it. Obviously, the initial niche that started was essentially gray and black market activity. And I, as a guy who likes freedom, am like all about that. I mean, just because something's illegal doesn't mean that it's immoral or wrong. And in many cases, the worse a country is, the more vital it is that people have an option to break the law and enter markets that are technically banned. And so I think gray markets, black markets, potentially jurisdictions that ban certain things, having an outlet, that's a niche that, again, you don't have a lot of other options, where Bitcoin really does have a genuine advantage over pretty much all of the other players. So it's possible that trying to say, let's just take it to the whole world right now, when it's not useful to most of them, is not going to work, and you focus on one market that you can dominate. But it's also possible, given that we're talking about a payment system, that it's kind of like it's got to get spun up pretty fast for a lot of people, or else it just won't work. It will get outpaced. I'm not entirely sure. I sort of go back and forth on that. Like, I get excited just philosophically every time a new merchant's accepting Bitcoin Cash or whatever. That's really cool. Whether or not like that's the winning strategy, like I said, Praxis started accepting Bitcoin. We had like 2 people pay with Bitcoin, and nobody has ever asked since. So it's not like it created a bunch of value for us necessarily. I like it intellectually, but so I don't know. I kind of go back and forth. But I do think that the beauty is we don't necessarily have to know, as long as we have a process where anybody can go and try all these different strategies and see what's working.
Yeah, so I'm of the let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think hopefully that the lesson gets out, though, that perhaps, make sure to target customers more than just the maybe the same old song and dance of everyone can use this, and we're not going to distinguish our marketing and our advertising in any unique way. But so that's really cool. So as we conclude now, you mentioned Praxis. I want to go to your new project that you're working on right now, Crash.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to throw one more thing on that final thought. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I agree that like trying to say, hey, everybody adopt it is a bad strategy. Just for, again, the signaling component. If I walk around and I start to see Bitcoin accepted stickers on a whole bunch of stores, it starts to signal to me this thing is actually legit. Even if I never use it, the more that happens, it does have like an effect that I think is potentially all of a sudden gets you to that step change. I don't know if it does or not, but it's possible. So here's what is cool about Crash. I'm going to use a gratuitous crypto analogy because I actually think of it this way. So the whole idea that, started with Praxis of, hey, you don't need a college degree to get your career started. You need 2 things. You need the ability to create value and the ability to prove it. And what a degree is a signal. People buy it because it's a signal. It's a costly signal. But what's happening with degree inflation, everybody's getting degrees, the value of the signal is declining. The informational content is lower and lower. Everybody has them. It doesn't mean that much. Meanwhile, the cost of building a better signal is also declining. It's possible now to create information that conveys and showcases your skill in a more robust way than it ever was before, because information technology has brought the cost down so low. And so with Praxis, it was, let's help people kind of build projects and then get them into these startups. And so that they can sort of, their combination of projects and experience will speak louder than any degree or absence of degree. And Crash sort of puts that on a platform, and kind of one of our slogans is be your own credential. And the idea is proof of work rather than proof of paper, where you have a bullet point resume with trusted third parties saying this person graduated, they're certified, and you got to trust that whoever grants that certification, that it actually means something, and that trust is eroding, versus proof of work. I don't need to tell you, trust the Western Michigan University. I'm a smart person. Here's my GPA. I can say, here's something I built. Here's a landing page I made that showcases my copywriting ability. Here's a podcast I created. It's proof of work. I'm demonstrating in tangible ways, costly signals that are hard to fake, right? And taking the time to, let's say, send a pitch to you specifically as a company. Say, I want to work for you. I built this for you. Wow, that's a costly thing that's hard to fake. That's proof of my skill. That's much more robust than me just trusting that your college degree means something about your ability. And so Crash is kind of the platform to help people find and win that first job. Really, it's a reverse jobs board where they create skills profiles to demonstrate their skills, to showcase what they can do, proving it in tangible ways, and then go take that onto the job hunt and run it like a marketing and sales process where they are selling their skills and their ability and using that to win opportunities. So you can go to crash.co to check it out if you want to.
Awesome. So I recommend everybody go do that. Check that out. Check out Praxis as well. Check out all the great stuff. Check out Rory Sutherland's book we mentioned. Great stuff. Alchemy. You can find that on Amazon. And as another good book to chime off of the last point you made before the intro to Crash there, there's a book called Black Stretchy Pants, which is like the story of Chip Wilson, the founder of Lululemon, and how he created his company. And he was talking about how do we think about like building something when no one else is and knowing this is going to be good in the long run. And you mentioned when you start to see Bitcoin stickers all around, you get the feeling of, oh, something's happening here. Psychologically, it's triggering something. And so Chip Wilson was walking around in Vancouver in the late 1990s, and he started to see like a yoga poster here. He started to see, in the magazine, there was an advertisement for yoga class and clothing, and women were starting to come into his, at that time, which was like an athletic apparel company, mainly for like skiing and snowboarding, with sort of yoga needs. And so all the way back then, he saw the signs that, hey, yoga is going to be big. And in a similar, we can look at crypto and even, hey, it's one store, it's a sticker here, a sticker there. It might not mean a lot, but just the sheer fact that that's starting to happen. And when we see the constellation of all those things come together, this might take the same exponential trajectory that now, not only the sort of yoga as a activity, as an idea gain traction, but now Lululemon is probably one of the most valuable companies that you could have invested in like 10 years ago. So,
so when are the CoinSpice branded yoga pants coming on the market?
Oh, you have no idea how real that that idea might be, but there is a whole product line of different merchandise that CoinSpice is rolling out, and yoga pants are at the top of the list. Don't you worry.
I love
it. We just have to figure out where we put the pepper.
Gonna be spicy, extra spicy. Hey man, this was a blast. Thanks for having me on. And if anybody wants to shoot me an email or whatever, you can go to isaacmorehouse.com and find all that stuff. And I'm happy to chat.
Great. Well, everybody, stay spicy.